Greetings one and all, I'm Red Angel, and welcome to another episode of I Love It Anyway, a series where I talk about media I love that is inherently flawed, but I enjoy it despite this fact. A pseudo-review and analysis, if you will. Today, we shall be discussing Call of Cthulhu. I didn't expect my first game that I'd end up finishing in the great year 2022 to be a tabletop-inspired Lovecraftian horror mystery, yet here we are. Call of Cthulhu is, as I stated, a tabletop game that I haven't had a chance to play, but I'm familiar with the rules enough to know how a game of it would work. So needless to say, a video game based off of something that I'm already interested in is, well, intriguing to say the least. It was announced back in 2014, and it was published in 2018 by Cyanide. Needless to say, I was already invested in its over 4 years of development. If I had a nickel for every somewhat flawed, heavy story emphasis game was created by a French studio that I really enjoyed, well, in that case, I'd have 2 nickels. It isn't a lot. It isn't a lot at all. But it's weird it's happened twice.
Now you're totally stuck in the retro zone. Sad face.
I didn't purchase the game when it initially came out. I waited until it was on a fantastic sale for only $5. Bought it and finally tried it out on the PS4. Was it worth $5? Yes. Was it worth the $20 to $30 I often see it priced at? I think that'll ultimately depend on how much you enjoy the story and the gameplay, so let's get into it. I have to say that the gameplay of Call of Cthulhu is about what you would expect from a mystery investigative game. It's similar to The Council, which was also published by Focus Interactive, and is an absolute trip. You level up between each massive cinematic set piece and put more points in specific attributes, except for occultism and medicine. You have to learn those by exploring the world. Considering our protagonist is the farthest thing from a doctor or an occultist, a fantastic and fascinating caveat to add. To discover all the intricate lore of this game, you have to deliberately study the artifacts that you find lying around the island. The problem with this, of course, being that this inflicts madness on yourself, which is something you might want if you want to study occultism in the game and unlock all of the little secrets. Meanwhile, with medicine, you have to pick up a book and read it. Well, at least it's realistic. Give or take 11 years or so. In the end, increasing your points in any of the attributes gives you a better chance of discovering anything new about the island or its mysteries. Note how I said chance. That's right! Call of Cthulhu is entirely probability based when you do skill checks. The higher number of points you put into a skill, the more likely you'll pass a skill test. Yet, you'll find this isn't guaranteed though. Some may find this immensely frustrating. Typically, when you raise a stat up all the way up to its maximum potential, you'll always find that you pass your skill check in a normal video game. Too bad that this is not a normal video game. Call of Cthulhu attempts to emulate the rules and general atmosphere of a H.P. Lovecraft story alongside the tabletop roleplay experience. So that means you won't always succeed, but this adds an extra layer to all of this. Sometimes you can try absolutely wacky things and somehow succeed. It's a low chance, but there's still a chance. That's how probability works, everybody. This means you can reload your save every time you fail a skill check if you are so inclined, which won't be tedious at all. Hey, oh no. Okay, I may have done it once or twice, or 6 times, but I wanted the whole mystery, so can you blame me on that one? This mechanic alone gives the game some sort of tension that you don't find in mainstream titles. Every action can lead to an unfavorable outcome. Since there is an autosave feature, you'll often be stuck with your bad choices. It's put there to mainly encourage players to replay the game. Unless you have a guide open, you won't 100% complete Call of Cthulhu on your first try, especially when you consider that many of the skill checks are related to your achievements. If you fail once, you won't get the achievement. In addition to that, there's a multitude of collectibles you can find throughout the story, which may confuse you further if you're not paying attention. Luckily for me, I hyper-focused on this game and its lore, wanting to dig into Cyanide's interpretation of the Lovecraftian Mythos. I can say safely say I wasn't disappointed despite only getting 75% completion by my finished run. Should note that while the graphics aren't terrible, they're nothing to look at either. Pretty middle of the road, realistic enough to know the images you are seeing are people. The facial expressions are bare, and luckily the voice acting salvages any time the facial expression is lacking. Graphics are really a non-factor while playing, and while I'd say the sound design emulates a spooky atmosphere, there are spots that there are odd bits of silence that don't make sense. The music hits one or two notes on the repetitive side, which is grating when you have to retry a puzzle or a boss fight a couple of times. Mostly the painting one. Now let's talk about Call of Cthulhu's initial narrative hook. You are a private investigator who has been through some trauma, hasn't had work in quite a while, and is implied to be an alcoholic. One day, after a terribly Lovecraftian dream, you're offered a job.
My daughter and her family died. Everyone is accusing my daughter of doing it because she has seemingly prophetic powers. Can you find out the truth?
Considering Edward Pierce's current prospects for work and having no idea how big of a red flag isolated island is, he says, "Okay," and off you go. Darkwater Island is filled with suspicious fishermen, sailors, aristocrats, and doctors who obviously know something is going on. This is presented with the subtlety of a pile of bricks getting dropped onto your skull. Pretty much every single person in this town is sus in some capacity, and this isn't my genre savviness talking. Well, at least not only that. The game makes it immensely clear from jump that something is going on in the town that is not only a conspiracy of some kind, but involves some supernatural antics. This is a Lovecraftian title through and through. While the enigmatic, existential dread is present in this title, I wouldn't say it's necessarily genre-breaking. There was a certain amount of predictability to it that did take away from certain scenes, yet the journey to get to 3 out of the 4 endings that I viewed was interesting enough to keep me invested. I'll say that the oppressive atmosphere worked best when sticking to the real world, since I felt real tension in scenes with conversations that were actually happening. Yet when the more otherworldly things happened, it came off as more formulaic than anything else. Using Lovecraftian elements in your story isn't exactly new. You could potentially explain a lot of the strange idiosyncrasies and the plot holes in this game as Lovecraftian storytelling. From what I've played, the narrative tried to use it more as a crutch every once in a while, and it sometimes came off as unsatisfying, especially during certain climaxes and finales of the story. You'll notice that I'm being more straightforward and vague with this edition of I Love It Anyway, and there's a reason for that. Call of Cthulhu is very story heavy, and even the footage that I'm showing you now gives away the first few chapters, maybe a little more depending, but nothing involving the big climactic ending or any of the very interesting puzzles you get to later on. This is one of those titles that's much better to experience on your own for the first time, rather than having some rando on YouTube telling you about it. Call of Cthulhu is relatively short, which means if I reveal too much here, I'd be essentially spoiling the whole game, which I'd rather avoid. Now suppose this is not what you want out of a game. Maybe the probability thing really bothers you, or dear old Edward Pierce is too similar to Jonathan from Vampire. Look between these 2 images and tell me the difference. Spoiler alert, you can't! Listen, I know they're 2 different characters, but they fill the same role, and it's uncanny how much they mirror each other in so many ways. In that case, there are Lovecraftian-inspired games that'll give you the themes of Lovecraft without the probability-based gameplay. Might I recommend World of Warcraft? Listen, jokes aside, World of Warcraft had some really well done Lovecraftian horror with its old gods, but I wouldn't tell you to torture yourself with playing that dumpster fire as it is now. Look up the cool lore, save your money, don't support Activision Blizzard. If you want actual recommendations, well, I have a few of those. If you can get it to work, Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth, which this game took a lot of inspiration from, just saying, was an underrated gem by Bethesda back in 2005 when I played. It is very Shadow over Innsmouth, which is my favorite Lovecraftian story, so I'm naturally biased for this one. Otherwise, Sunless Seas, Darkest Dungeon, Amnesia the Dark Descent is what I'd throw your way if you want to scratch the itch of the encroaching darkness and genuine stifling fear of the unknown. With all that said, if you see it on sale, I'd give Call of Cthulhu a shot. It has a sort of intense, otherworldly atmosphere that I've always enjoyed in horror as a genre. Of course, it has its campy, head-scratching moments, but I think for the most part, it's a solid entry in the video game Lovecraftian library. I'm Red Angel, and I'll see you next time.